Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law. And they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you, or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. I'm a little interested what this may be like, because this isn't actually something I prepared to talk about, but it's actually a paper I wrote earlier in the semester, and it's about one of the less favorite parts of the book of Ruth, at least for most people. Usually it's what happens later on in the story that gets more attention. That's when it seems like Ruth becomes more of the main character than Naomi is here. When I wrote this, of course, you begin with kind of the setting, which is in chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. And it's actually surprising how little there is. It seems like 10 years come and go. This family moves from the house of Judah, literally the house of bread. And so it's kind of ironic that Bethlehem, which means house of bread, would be where there's a famine. And so this family, a husband and wife and their 2 sons, depart for Moab, which would have been east across the Jordan River, about 70 miles for them to journey. How many days that would have taken, I don't know. How long were they there? The story doesn't say, but the 2 sons, who ironically their names mean sickly person and mortal one, maybe foreshadowing for something devastating to come, die. One woman and her 2 daughters-in-law. And in this culture would have meant pretty much more devastation, because women seemed to be marginalized if they didn't have a husband. They didn't have someone to provide for them. They didn't have financial security or anything like that. And so Naomi does what anyone really could have expected of her. She returns to her hometown of Bethlehem, and like anyone would have done, encouraged her 2 daughters-in-law to go back to Moab. At least they had a chance to find a husband. At least they had a chance to make a future for themselves. And in verse 8, as they begin journeying together, Naomi abruptly stops and requests for Orpah and Ruth to turn back to Moab. We don't know how far along they were, where they were, what they were really talking about up until then, but tells them to go home. Here, Ruth says that she wishes the Lord will deal kindly with them, literally show them a word which means loyalty or kindness, who, speaking in terms of God, would not be someone that Ruth and Orpah would really know about. And this time, it wasn't you convert religions. It was, you become married to someone, and so you live with your husband and his family, and whatever religion they practice, you practice. It wasn't what we think of today where someone converts. That was really not heard of. Even in the Old Testament, there's not really mention made of Israelites being commissioned by God to go and convert people. Kind of an unfamiliar thing to us as Christians. Aside from the later display of God's faithfulness toward Naomi and Ruth, the book uniquely exhibits these categories of loving kindness, loyalty, through adversity and through an uncertain future. It's actually kind of unique how it happens, because God doesn't really show up in the story. It's kind of like the book of Esther, where in the book of Esther, God's not mentioned at all, but somehow we see him through the backstory. It's kind of the same way with Ruth. God's mentioned at the beginning, but doesn't really show up throughout. And so, for me, when I read Ruth, I think that, in a way, Ruth shows us God. It's Ruth who doesn't have to, but does anyway. She shows kindness and loyalty to Naomi, who she had no obligation to at all anymore, really. Though Naomi encountered resistance from Orpah and Ruth in regard to her initial request for them to go home, Orpah departs reluctantly at first, but Ruth stays. Naomi again encourages them to return home, but again, Ruth decides to stay. In many ways, I guess we could not really say that Orpah does something wrong here, but it's almost the opposite, where Ruth goes the extra mile. Ruth does what isn't expected of her. Ruth, it says in the text that Ruth clings to her, something that would at this time have been said of a husband and wife clinging to each other. Of course, there's a lot of connotations there, but definitely this intimate connection. And so Ruth has that with Naomi, a woman that, again, she had no obligation to show loyalty to. These feelings that Ruth has show her strength and her bravery. Throughout the Old Testament, especially Genesis, all these stories of Abraham and Isaac and all these men, these heroes who show these great acts of bravery and strength, and yet it's a woman, someone who, again, in this culture just would not have been thought of as strong or brave. Women were thought, unfortunately, as weak and many times as property. And so to have a woman and a Moabite, nonetheless, someone that the Israelites would have hated, she's the one who becomes the heroine. She's the one who saves Naomi in a way. Again, we could say that God provides ultimately, but it's Ruth, nonetheless, who goes to Boaz later in the story. And though it's kind of unethical the way Naomi and Ruth go about it, and you kind of turn your head like, what exactly were they doing? Nonetheless, Ruth becomes the one who really saves this family from death, Naomi and herself. Perhaps these poetic lines that Ruth gives, verses 16 through 18, are most familiar to us. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, even if death parts me from you. I will go are words spoken by Abraham in Genesis 12, where God tells him to go from his country, his family, and to this strange foreign place that I'll show you. Ruth does that with less security and less promise. It appears that Naomi and her will be on their own. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. At first, it kind of seems like it goes against what I said, where Naomi, or Ruth rather, understands that who God is, and this is going to be who I worship now. But the way Hebrew poetry works, your people shall be my people, and your God my God, actually mean the same thing. And so it wasn't necessarily Ruth converting religiously, but really converting to Naomi and her family. But because faith and family go hand in hand at this time, you could say, I guess, that she was converting to this new Israelite religion. For me, this story really shows commitment to people that Ruth didn't have to. Family meant everything. Genealogies were so important. And so for a Moabite enemy to show loyalty and love to someone who she didn't have to would have been a slap in the face to Israelites who, if we understand when this book was written, probably were Israelites coming back from Babylonian captivity. And as they were coming back, they had all these people who had been kind of put in their land. They were taken to Babylon, new people from other cultures were brought in. And so you can imagine when they came back, they were thinking, who gives them the right to be here? This is our land. And so if Ruth was written during that time, it was almost a slap in the face to them that a Moabite woman would be the one that God shows favor because of her loyalty. And so almost a lesson to them. The book of Ruth is about family, like I said, and an oddly shaped one at that. Being the basic institutional structure in Israel, families shaped communities. Communities were made up of these tight-knit families. And so for the book of Ruth to show this uncharacteristic, unfamiliar type of family to be who God blesses says a lot. Though we look at people from divorce and all these other types of oddly shaped families, though they don't look like us and might not act like us and come from where we come and so on and so forth, God can still respect them and show them the same love that he shows us in this story and in ours. The book of Ruth usually comes after the book of Judges. That's because Christians and their Bibles come from the order of the Septuagint, which would have been a translation of the Hebrew Bible. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then 1 Samuel. But the way it was actually written, the Hebrew Bible, Ruth came after Proverbs. And you may say, well, that's kind of strange. I mean, after all, Ruth, we think of it as a historical book, not a work of poetry like Proverbs. It's interesting that Proverbs 31 immediately precedes Ruth. Proverbs 31, you may remember, is this personification of the virtuous woman, the woman who provides for her family, the woman who does all these amazing things and possesses all these amazing qualities. And so I like to think it's almost like Ruth is intentionally placed after Proverbs to showcase the virtuous woman and connect her with Ruth, who is strong and capable. Ruth who provides. Ruth who shows loyalty. Though she may not be acknowledging genuine subjective faith to God, I think Ruth shows us God's faithfulness to his people. Ruth also reminds me of Esther. Esther, who was another great woman hero who provided for her people. And so I think it's important that we have the Old Testament where it's usually men who are portrayed, men who dominate the scene, and yet God uses women to accomplish his purposes.